So let's talk about tenant occupied sales, buyer or seller rep side on residential property. So we're seeing a lot more of this come up, and it will continue, I think, because we're in a short inventory environment. So navigating tenancy becomes important. So let's first talk about the seller rep side. So on the seller rep side, your first two questions are going to be, do you have a lease with the tenant? And the other is, what arrangements or discussions have you had with them about selling? So first and foremost, I'll share my screen here and we'll talk about ending tenancy. So this is the Alberta Tenancies website. Tenancies laws are provincial, and so often we're seeing that show up too with people from BC or Ontario having misconceptions about tenancy laws. So if you have a tenancy agreement in place, there's two types, fixed term or periodic. So if it's fixed, means you have a lease. That lease has an end date. So the most common is like a monthly tenancy, 12-month term or 6-month term or whatever, and the tenant lease ends December 31st, say. Technically, the landlord does not even need to give any notice. If they haven't re-entered a new lease agreement, the tenant has to vacate at the end of that lease. Now, that's not usually how it goes. Typically, people will have some conversations. But if you're selling a property and they have a fixed term lease, this is the important part, is unless both parties agree to early terminate. So if there's a lease, the buyer has to assume that tenant, or the seller is liable to get rid of that tenant before the end of their lease term. So I've generally found in my investing career that depending on the situation, offering a tenant maybe 1 month free rent, perhaps like seasoning it or sweetening the pot a little bit with giving their security deposit back like really quickly or not charging any deductions, and or offering to give a portion or pay a portion based on a dollar amount for movers. Or even if I know people who have trailers and trucks and stuff like that, they'll like lend the tenant that stuff. That can be a great way to incent the tenant to kind of work with the seller to move out earlier. Periodic tenancy. So what is periodic? Periodic means I don't have a lease. They've just lived there for a couple years, or what most commonly is referred to as month to month. So if it's month to month, you can end for different reasons. If the landlord or relative of the landlord wants to move into the property, and there's some definitive things around that: blood relative, marriage, adoption, adult independent relationship. The landlord agrees to sell the premises. All conditions of the sale agreement have been satisfied or waived, and the buyer or a relative of the buyer wants to move in. So this is the most common, is they'll give 90 days notice. The most common misconception is people will give 90 days notice to a tenant saying, I'm selling the property, but they don't have an offer yet. They're giving them notice to move out because they want to put it up for sale. Know that if the tenant agrees and moves out, great. But if they don't and fight back, that's because you have to work with the tenant while they're in there. You can't vacate them for that purpose. If you plan to demolish it for rental purposes, demolish the rental premises, so you're going to do redevelopment or something, and this covers kind of the same thing for condo conversion and some of those things. And there's a few other random uses, like you're converting a house to be an office that you're going to use for your office, things like that. And major renovations. So if you're going to conduct major renovations on the property, that doesn't include painting or replacing flooring or other things. So no, this is a great website. I'll link to it below. It gives that information. And if you're dealing on tenanted property, as always, just reach out to us. We'll help you navigate the individual situation, but don't just think like, oh, my seller's taking care of that. They said it's fine. Your obligation as the listing agent and as the buyer representative as well is to verify that those things have been covered. So you don't come to possession date and now the tenant's still in there, they can't get them out, your buyer's left homeless, or whatever the other situation is, and now everyone's sucked into a giant problem that could have been avoided dealing with these things up front.